Well, happy Sunday afternoon to folks who will be coming in and joining us here. Welcome to Two More Historic Events, the next live stream as we get ready for our first event at Neuner next August, portraying the Ninth Ohio, three companies of it at the Battle of Carnifax Ferry. I'm Will, one of the hosts, and want to welcome you today and welcome our guests. Now you see all of us on the screen. You recognize Andrew Hufftailing, who's been with us before from the Ninth Ohio. We also have David Dixon with us, and it's some of David's research, and our friend from Germany, Felix Zimmermann. Today, we're going to talk about one man who was with the Ninth Ohio and helped organize the Ninth Ohio and then switches over, and his name is August Wilich. David, let you start with a little bit of introduction here because, of course, part of the reason we're here is on the beginning of this past month, you just released a new book. Why don't you tell us about yourself and tell us about it?
Well, hi. So I'm Dave Dixon. I live in Santa Barbara, California, and I'm a historian. And you're right. In late August, I published the first English language biography of August Wilich, and it's published by University of Tennessee Press. And I'm really happy to be here.
Great. Tell us a little bit about how you can, how people can find the book if they're looking for it in a way that supports you as an author.
Sure. Well, you can go to my website. It's www.davidtdixon.com, and you can hit the link there, read the introduction, and if you'd like, order the book by hitting the PayPal button.
Fantastic. Well, great. Other new face, Felix. Welcome to Two More Historic Events, to the live stream, and thanks for spending the time. I know part of the reason we're doing this as what we're calling a matinee on a Sunday is because of our time change. Tell us about yourself and where you're at.
Yeah, hi. Great to be here. Thank you. So I've been working on a dissertation about August Wilich at a German university for quite a while now. And my main focus is on Willich's Republican ideas, which can be rediscovered today with some benefit. And because back in the 19th century, political terminologies were quite different than today, where especially in the US, republicanism and socialism are seen as opposites. This was quite different in Willich's day. And I mean, what you have to know is that Wilich was not only a military hero in the Union and the Civil War, but he was also one of the early figureheads of the labor movement and socialism in America.
Fantastic. Everybody, I see some folks joining us and jumping in. If you have a chance, say hi in the comments and we'll see who's here. Andrew, any thoughts before we get going?
Well, it's August Wilich only spent about three and a half months with the Ninth Ohio. So time-wise, he didn't really have a great impact on the regiment, but he was one of the people who organized the regiment. So, for one, I think he's a good study just in what we talked about in our last live stream of what it means to be a German. If you look at the map here, Wilich was actually born in what is modern-day Poland. Yet his entire life, he speaks about what it means to be a German and the German spirit. And then, despite having been gone from the Ninth Ohio by the time of Carnifax Ferry by approximately a month or so, Wilich probably had arguably the most profound effect on at least the military organization of the regiment. His study is very important in the context of the Ninth Ohio.
Great. Well, that's fantastic. And of course, obviously, we're talking about an event that portrays September of 1861. If he's there for a few months, he's there most of the time of the regiment until we get there. There is a little bit of time he'll leave before Carnifax Ferry, but still, if you look at that time, he's there a great percentage of that. So he's somebody these men know. And again, that's part of our getting into the men's head and getting into figuring out who these humans are. We'll say hi to Alex and hi to Eric Bonikowski. Thanks, fellas. Glad to have you with us today. Let's move into Felix's life here. Felix, if you would take us through Wilich's early life, please.
Yeah, you mean Willich's life, not Felix's life.
No, my apologies.
So, yeah, as a start, I mean, Wilich, if you think about him, he was one of those revolutionaries who was willing to sacrifice all of his privileges that he was born with for a greater cause. And he was born as a Prussian aristocrat and eventually decided to renounce his nobility and to go along with the revolutionary movements of his time. And in this, you could say he was maybe the type of revolutionary that resembled in many ways that of someone like Mikhail Bakunin, the great Russian anarchist. Wilich was born into a family of theologians and military officers, and he lost his father very early. He was not even 4 years old, and he was supposed to follow the footsteps of his father, who had also been a Prussian military officer. And when Wilich was just 12 years old, he was sent to a cadet school in Potsdam and later in Berlin. And pretty much until the late 30s of his life, he had quite an exemplary military career going on and was advancing to the rank of a company commander in the Prussian military. But at the same time, during his early youth, he seemed to have been on a quite different path than his older brother, for example, who was a loyal Prussian soldier. And this is mainly because Wilich was living in the household of a very famous theologian and liberal thinker, Schleiermacher, a philosopher in Germany. And this man had probably a big influence on him. So he learned very early to question authority, and he came in contact with liberal and Republican ideas at a very early age.
And I can say that we're seeing a picture of Schleiermacher right now, Felix. So.
Yeah, and it certainly took some time until he was ready to act on those ideas.
Great. Well, can you talk to me a little bit more about his military service here?
Yes. So he was advancing pretty fast, and he was very young when he was promoted to first lieutenant. And then he got stationed in the Westphalia area in Germany, where he later became a company commander. And he was deeply influenced by the ideas of the Prussian reform movement. And those ideas were basically, civil and military reforms that were implemented in Prussia starting in 1807. And those reforms were later eclipsed by conservative restoration efforts, but some key elements of those reforms persisted in society. And one idea of those reformers was to overcome the divide between the military caste and the citizenry. And this was to be accomplished by a militia system called the Landwehr in German. And while such a system was only partially implemented, the broader idea was basically one of the cornerstones of Willich's later radicalism. And then you have, of course, the early socialist ideas in the Rhineland, which also heavily influenced him and quite a few of his other fellow officers. And we have to be clear here that it's not about Marxism at this point in time, which didn't exist, but there were several strands of socialism back in the day. And Wilich was influenced by different strands of socialism, like early German and French socialism.
Okay. Well, I understand that even though he is a successful officer, he decides to resign his commission. Can you talk to me about why he resigns if he's doing a good job? What changes for him?
Yeah, you could say he was from his 30s maybe, he was a Republican trying to get along in the Prussian army. And one of the slogans that he used to tell people was, "I'm first a human, then citizen, and then soldier." So, and this was pretty much a outrageous belief for a Prussian officer during that time.
Well, let me stop you. Let me stop you there for a second, Felix, and let's talk terminology just a little bit.
Yes.
Of course, in America, we talk about republicanism with a small r. We talk about the Republican Party as one of our two major political parties with, of course, a capital R. Talk to me about when you say he was a Republican and a soldier in his mindset and in the context of what, the late 1830s, early 1840s in Germany? Can you talk to me a little about those definitions?
Yeah, so maybe, where do we start? Republicanism is a concept with a lot of history. So, and in Germany and in the US too, it was not only a specific form of the state, but it was an idea that could be implemented in all spheres of society, not only in the military, in the political system, but also in economic life, for example. And Wilich was one of those Republicans that who had a very thorough understanding of republicanism. He wanted to see it implemented in every sphere of life, and he would not stop even at spheres like the economy. So he had an idea of republicanizing the economy, and that is the code word for socialism. Yeah? So he wanted to create a republic in the sphere of the economy, for example. And it's quite difficult to understand today.
Okay, well, something we're grappling to do as we look to understand these men. Understanding their leaders and their thoughts are really important to us, and one of the things we've talked about is understanding different courses of thought within the world, because all Germans aren't one block. Everybody has their own thoughts. So learning some of these different ideas. Andrew or David, before we continue forward with the story, anything and either of you want to bring and chime in here?
No,
I think that he covered it pretty well from my understanding. He's the expert.
Okay. Well, let's take ourselves forward. And Felix, I'll turn back to you here. Of course, people talk about the 48ers and the revolution in 48 in Germany. It's a big part of the military experience that sets up many Germans' experience in the American Civil War because of what happens in Germany. Can you talk about the outbreak of the revolution, how it started, and get us going here so we have a base understanding?
Yeah, so the European revolutions of 1848, I mean, they were caused by multiple factors. You had a decline of standard of living, you had economic crises, you had bad harvests, you had price rises and so on. And it was a heated atmosphere that just needed one last straw for it to explode. And this happened when the French chased away their king, Louis Philippe, and proclaimed the Republic in early 1848. And Germany followed very soon after, and you had a revolutionary situation there in March as well.
All right, so you've said French, you said Germany. How far does this reach in Europe?
The 1848 revolutions were a European revolution. It started with France, but the outreach was all of Europe, so except England.
Okay. Well, let's talk about it. If you're going to have a war, you need to have people opposed on opposite sides. Let's talk about who the belligerents or who the opposing sides are here, if you would.
Yeah, so the 1848, 1849 revolutions in Germany were basically an attempt to turn the German states, a lot of states back then, into a unified national state under a constitution that would guarantee some basic human rights and freedoms. And of course, there were different groups operating with very different political visions. And only a minority of them was decidedly Republican. Others would compromise and be, for example, satisfied with a constitutional monarchy, for example. As far as Wilich was concerned, he and his friends acted, of course, on the far left wing, and they were opposed to any sort of compromise approach that would boil down to a constitution that was not a true republic, but a constitutional monarchy. Wilich and his friends saw this as not a viable option, and in fact as a monstrosity for their republican ideals. And I mean, we can dive into what happened in those revolutions right now, if you want me to.
I think, Andrew, what's your sense of things here? How deep do you want to get in?
We're going to talk a little bit more deeply about the actual revolutions themselves, but I think the viewers probably need a sort of base over of how the revolutions progressed and how they turned out. But can you talk a little bit more, Felix, about some of the differing factions on the revolutionary side? We talk about you talked about Marxism not being a thing, but Marx was certainly alive and active at this time. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I can do that, but I have to have a disclaimer here. The real factions in the revolutionary side only open up after the revolution. So all those different ideas of how to progress really open up after the revolution, because during this revolution nobody had time to think about it. What's important is that you had this situation where the parliament in Germany was created a constitution, and the king was asked to accept it. But the king declined, and other local rulers also declined this constitution. And after that, you had violent uprisings in 1849, and Wilich was of course part of this. And it was really a mass movement of a revolutionary army that was trying to fight for this constitution and was eventually crushed by Prussian forces. And after this event, when Willich's men were literally the last group to leave German territory after the Prussians crushed the insurrection in July 1849, after this event, we have this massive wave of immigration of revolutionaries to England and the United States. And this is the moment where it starts that in the radical camp, for example, in the socialist camp between Wilich and Karl Marx, there was quite a different view on how things were progressing from here on. So if we want to talk about the differences, then we have to talk about the exile that happened after the revolution.
Okay. Well, as we turn towards defeat and exile and see some of the difference, I think, David, this is a great place to bring you into the conversation here.
Yeah, great. Felix is exactly right. I mean, this was there was no consensus around this revolution to begin. So there were 3 violent rebellions, and they were put down rather easily. And then these refugees ended up initially in France, and then in Switzerland, and then finally in London, where most of the European revolutionaries from 1848, not just the German-speaking folks, but almost all these radical revolutionaries from all of these different countries end up in London. So it's quite a hothouse of ideas, and there begins to be a lot of squabbling between these different factions. So you have Karl Marx, for example, by this time really feels that the window for violent revolution in Europe has pretty much passed. And he's also further refined his ideas to believe that the economy needed to pass through several different stages of development before you could get to a situation where something like communism could be instituted. On the other hand, Wilich and his supporters on the left, Felix mentioned the anarchists, for example, and the French followers of Louis Blanc and those type of revolutionaries, they believe that they still need to foment violent revolution in Europe. So they spend the next really practically 3 years trying to cook up these different schemes, from forming parties to invade Hamburg to raising money in America for a German national loan project. So these tensions are building between Wilich and Marx. And so they have violent disagreements, not only politically, but also personally. I mean, at this point, Wilich is trying to bed Karl Marx's wife at the same time that Karl Marx is banging the housekeeper. So there's a lot of personal animosity. It comes to a head in 1850 at a meeting of the Communist League, where Karl Marx calls Wilich an uneducated, 4 times cuckolded jackass. And before Wilich could challenge Marx to a duel, which was certainly his intention, one of the young Marx acolytes steps up and challenges Wilich. And unfortunately, this young acolyte had never handled a pistol before, and Wilich, as the man being challenged, of course, has his choice of weapons. So he chooses pistols. They go across the channel to Belgium. They have this duel, and Wilich shoots the man in the head. Fortunately, he survives. But so this is kind of the state of affairs for radical revolutionaries in London. It's all over the place. They're spending a lot more time bickering about different philosophies than they are trying to move the ball forward, and it degenerates really into a lot of name calling and reputation destroying, to the point of where Wilich decides to emigrate finally to America in 1853. So once he's in America, of course, he continues his political activism, and we could talk a lot about that, but I'm not sure we have that kind of time. So there's one thing you should know is he really, once he gets to America, he realizes that communism is not a practical solution there. So he develops his own theories of more along the lines of what Felix was talking about earlier, in terms of more of a Republican socialism. And a lot of interesting things transpire during that time. For example, he forms an alliance with local black leaders to protest the execution of John Brown. So this man is a violent radical who is trying to adapt his tactics to meet his new environment in America.
Yeah, before I start, maybe one addition. The quarrels between Marx and Wilich were so deep and so nasty that Marx decided to even write a small book about Wilich. And this was published in early 1854 in New York, right after Wilich had arrived there, so that everybody could read what an evil man he was. So the result was even a small book. So this is quite interesting chapter.
As we get to see a look at the original copy of the book here and a bust of Marx, I believe, here. So,
yeah.
Good. Well, go ahead and I'll let you keep going there.
Keep going, yes. So, in late 1858, after some years in obscurity, Wilich went to Cincinnati when the German-American Working Men's Society in Cincinnati offered Wilich the editorship of a newspaper. It was called the Cincinnati Republikaner, Cincinnati Republican, and it was a labor newspaper and also the only daily one at its time in the whole country. So Willich's goal at daily labor newspaper. Yeah, so there were not many labor newspapers back in the day. Willich's goal was basically to kickstart a trade union movement in Cincinnati, and he in fact did manage to sustain a collaboration between German American and American trade unions when he became the secretary of an organization called the Cincinnati Trades Assembly. And basically he played an important role in the trade union movement until the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. And last but not least, the political program that he put forward in the Republikaner was quite unique in its own, and it foreshadowed some elements of what, for example, the syndicalist movement in the US would advocate for in the coming decades.
Great.
And yeah.
And I'll just say, Eric, I had Eric Bonikowski, thank you for reminding me to turn my microphone back on to the live stream. I had it paused because I coughed there a little bit ago. My apologies. So let me say a name to you, Felix, who I have here in our notes, and let you talk a little bit about the relationship. That's Fred Oberklein.
Yeah, Fred Oberklein is a good example of Willich's influence in the trade union movement, because he was the secretary of the National Molders Union, which was one of the very earliest national trade unions in the US. And at the same time, he was working for his newspaper, for the Republikaner. And Oberklein became the ambassador of the working men of Cincinnati when President Lincoln visited in February 1861. And he read an address to Lincoln, written by Wilich, and very militant in character. It basically said the German working man would not accept any compromise between free labor and slave labor. And it was kind of a volunteering for war before the war had even started.
Great. Well, the war starts, and we'll go to the war in just a minute. Before we do, Andrew, I'm going to let you jump in here. Talk to me about Oberklein, why we bring him up here. Talk to me about his relationship to the 9th Ohio, if you would, please.
Well, he's he's very important just as an example of the overall character of the 9th Ohio. He eventually, when he enlists, he becomes a sergeant in the 6th Company. And later he becomes a lieutenant in the 7th. And companies 6 through 9 were actually the companies that were raised by Wilich at the Arbeiterhalle, the Workers' Hall in Cincinnati. And so those companies were comprised of a lot of guys like Oberklein, who were members of local working organizations, trade unions, and that sort of thing. And so when the war breaks out, Wilich, that's something probably David or Felix can explain more about why he was in Evansville as opposed to Cincinnati. But he races back to Cincinnati, recruits 4 companies at the Workers' Hall. And in the course of the raising of the regiment, he's first voted as lieutenant colonel, but he actually steps back thinking that I think he sort of makes a miscalculation, assuming that the adjutant would be the de facto commander of the regiment in the U.S. military, and so he steps back to adjutant and becomes the drill master of the 9th Ohio. And you can kind of tell just how important he was to the regiment, because 30 years after the war, the 9th still writes about McCook making this comment that I'm just a clerk to 1,000 Dutchmen, being the colonel of the regiment, where they still at this point in 1897 called Wilich the regimental paterfamilias, which is a Latin term meaning it's the father of the family, and the father of the family in ancient times, I mean, he had absolute control over the family, and so he's extremely important. The question I have for the experts of sort of his thought, David and Felix, why what would you say the number one reason on his list of reasons why he enlisted in the war would be?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. Most of the Northern Union leaders, their purpose was really to save the constitutional union. That's why they signed up. But these 48ers, their motivations were quite different. So I think if you asked Wilich now, he'd probably say that to defeating the slave-holding aristocracy, which in his mind would be really the antithesis of Republican government and free labor, that would have been his driving motivation. I don't know if Felix agrees with that or not.
Basically agreeing. Maybe one step forward would be to acknowledge that he also had some kind of a positive vision for free labor. Free labor was not only the exact opposite to slave labor, but free labor was for him like a vision for workers to organize and to live in a society without wage labor. So it was kind of his socialist utopia was part of this free labor ideology, and he put it in there. For many other Republicans, free labor was just not slave labor, but Wilich had a positive vision of free labor. So, and this was also one of the reasons that he was fighting for the Union.
Great. Well, Andrew, as we get to see the man here, paterfamilias or not, let's talk about building the 9th Ohio, and let's also be sure we talk about our three companies in the 9th Ohio as they relate to Wilich, with them not being his own.
Sure. So the first three companies of the 9th Ohio are going to be the majority formed from the Turnverein, the Turner organizations in the Cincinnati area, as well as some other local areas. And that the Turners are going to be a completely different topic that we're going to go into more detail in a few months. But both of those organizations, especially or particularly the Cincinnati Turnverein and the local ones, they had sort of a similar vision that David and Felix just described. They were also radical in their views to some extent, and abolitionism and those sort of sentiments were found very widely within the ranks of the Turners. And so these are two forces that can easily work together to achieve the same goals. So when they put the regiment together, Wilich becomes the drill master, and we don't want to go too much into the specifics, but he does. We have a lot of evidence that goes into how he drills them in the Prussian style. So some of those examples would be extensive use of bugle calls. The accounts say that when the 9th Ohio was drilling at Camp Dennison, the only thing that you could hear was the tramping of feet and the calls of the bugles. Physical training, which was a big hallmark of the Turners. A lot of times they would even substitute their military drill for Turner exercises instead, feeling that those would do more for the body, and other sort of Wilich-isms would be within this regiment and within the 32nd Indiana, for example, the soldiers would not have used the formal verb forms Sie, haben Sie, or sprechen Sie, and so on, like the they would not have used the formal version. They would have used the familiar version, and this was sort of to reinforce that they were all friends and brothers working towards the same cause. And so, again, these are going to be more things that we go more into as we explore the impression over the course of the year. But you know, the regiment gets formed. They move to Camp Denison. The enlistment for the 9th Ohio filled almost immediately, and that was based off of the high enthusiasm for, you know, Wilich being behind the raising of this regiment. And so there's one story from the 9th Ohio's regimental history where two guys who were from Lexington, Kentucky, arrive at camp. Learning that the entire regiment is filled up, they go from company to company asking, you know, who's going to take us, and the entire regiment is full. And they say, well, we're just going to go join the 6th Ohio then. And an older officer tells them, "What, the 6th? All right, see this fence over across this field. Why don't you go run across this field and jump over the fence and come back? And if you can do that, then you'll be part of our regiment." And them being turners, they ran, they jumped over, put two hands on the fence, jumped over the fence, jumped back and ran back, and he accepted them to the regiment. And the old officer, of course, was Wilich. So he was just really instrumental in raising the regiment, and a very important part of its early character.
Fantastic. Well, we do have, as we go forward, Andrew, let's talk about his speech to the regiment here.
Sure. So the 9th Ohio was one of the early enlistment regiments for 3 months of service. But when it came time, the call came out for 3-year enlistment. The story goes, Wilich ordered the regiment out in a hollow square, and he gives this big speech. And essentially, it's those who are not willing to enlist for 3 years are sort of not worth the time. And if you remember from our first live stream, FinUp, the guy who told us about the rubber canteens, he also has a story about that particular incident, saying that there was one guy who didn't want to enlist for 3 years, and Wilich hung a sign around his neck that said "coward," and had him drummed out of the regiment. And so if you look at the comparison between the 3 months and 3 years regiments of the 9th Ohio, there's not much change at all. There were very many who retained that enlistment, or who re-enlisted.
Is my memory correct that FinUp is also the guy who has the great account about making flapjacks, who you shared with us last week?
That he is.
Same person. Is. Okay, great. Yep. He writes a lot there. Let's finish Wilich's time with us here in the 9th Ohio at the Battle of Rich Mountain, and then we'll follow him through a little bit more of his life.
Well, this is another account from FinUp, and I think it just speaks to something that happens time and time again in Wilich's career, his sort of reckless lack of concern for his own personal safety. FinUp just describes Wilich standing while they're taking fire at Rich Mountain. They weren't heavily engaged, but they were under fire. And Wilich calmly, matter-of-factly states to the rest of the regiment that they're firing too high, boys. There's no danger here. So it's just there are countless accounts of his doing even more perilous things in battle, for sure.
Wow. Well, as time comes, David, let me turn to you. It's time for Wilich to find another course away from the 9th Ohio. It takes a little bit away from our story for the event, but it keeps us in the life of who this man is. Will you pick up and take us on a little bit more of his journey?
Sure, happy to. I think the first thing to do is talk about why Governor Morton of Indiana might have chosen Wilich to lead the 1st German regiment from Ohio, which was the 32nd Indiana Infantry. And he could have easily made a political appointment. There were a lot of people competing for those type of positions. But he chose Wilich, and I think for a number of reasons. First, he really wanted to avoid all those political squabbles that he would have between interested parties. Second thing is, if you think about the German 48ers coming over, people like Franz Siegel and Karl Schurz and Wilich, these people were really folk heroes in their day. So these were men that or leaders that their men could look up to and really derive some inspiration from. So I think it was a good choice. So Wilich joins the 32nd Indiana, leads the 32nd Indiana in December of 1861 into their first major engagement at Rowlett Station in Kentucky. And here he employs the same hollow square formation that Andrew was just talking about, but against cavalry, Terry's Texas Rangers to be precise. And they were outnumbered 4-1, but because of that training that he had done with his regiment, they were able to fend off this much larger force of cavalry. It was a really important but small victory at the end of 1861, because 1861 was a terrible year for the Union Army. So then by 1862 in April, he's at Shiloh. Of course, the first real major bloodletting of the Civil War. And they arrive on the field about midday on the second day of the battle. Wilich and his regiment make 5 successive charges. They change front 9 times in the process. And at one point, the men get very excited, and they outrun their support on both their flanks. So Wilich halts them, rides around to the front of the regiment, and with his back to enemy fire, while men are dropping in the ranks, he is drilling them in the manual of arms exercise. And several people took note of that, Sherman and Grant, but it was called by one of the Union generals as the most audacious act of bravery they had seen in the entire war. So Wilich is promoted after Stones River to brigadier general. Unfortunately, he's on the Union right, the extreme right. He's a focal point of the attack at the bloody Battle of Stones River in Tennessee, where these troops are overrun. He's captured and ends up eventually in Libby prison, and uses that time, I think, very well in reflecting back on his Prussian army training and his studies of military tactics and history. And so when he comes back in May of 1863, or in April of 1863, he's got a lot of new ideas. And that's another hallmark of this man, is he was constantly coming up with innovative, daring tactics. And the most notable of which, I think, is his advanced firing technique.
Well, talk to me a little bit about that. And before I let you to that, I think you misspoke. You said he made brigadier general after Stones River. Did he make it after Shiloh before being captured at Stones River?
Yeah, yes, that's correct. That's
great.
They did it after Shiloh.
So, can you speak to the advanced? You speak to the advanced firing concept?
Absolutely. So basically, as far as we've been able to determine, he took this concept from some skirmishing manuals he had studied at the military academy, and some of these tactics probably go back a lot further, at least to Frederick the Great, if not further. But the innovation that he made was he decided to employ what was essentially a skirmishing tactic and use 4 ranks. And so the front rank would fire, and then the men in the 4th rank would scurry up to the front, replace those men, and fire. And then the 3rd rank would advance. And so they were able to maintain continuous fire by moving these men up to the front of the column, and while their counterparts were reloading. So it was really a devastating technique that he used first at Liberty Gap in Tennessee, and then later at Chickamauga.
Interesting. So it's interesting to somebody who's actually fairly well versed in the tactics of the day. It sounds a little bit like something that's a very not well-known tactic called street firing out of there. It sounds very much like that concept, only done at a rank level rather than by platoons or that. That's I'd love to see it done sometime. So
yeah, to Andrew's earlier point, I mean, he was not afraid to deviate from the tactical manuals that were that he was supposed to be using.
Well, that'll take you outside the box. So let's see here. Let me just take a quick look over here. Here's a question that maybe you can speak to, Dan. Eric writes us, and he says, first off, hey, Eric, how you doing? As we go into the 32nd Indiana, would Wilich have trained them primarily in the Prussian drill as he'd done with the 9th Ohio? Do we have any idea?
Yeah, we have some. Andrew, actually, I probably defer to Andrew because he's done a lot of, I think, groundbreaking research on this. So go ahead, Andrew.
Well, I mean, I don't want to get too, in the weeds or whatever, but it just goes down to we have to listen to what they tell us, and then we have to compare it to other things, to try and verify or not. And so my research tells me that both the 9th Ohio and the 32nd Indiana, as well as probably a few other regiments, used at least a version of the Prussian drill, probably adapted to the tactics of the time. The Prussian drill requires forming in 3 ranks, which is not really feasible in a combat situation. And so, like I said, without going too into detail, there's a lot of evidence that points in that direction. Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I'm sure I can say right now, being a drill head and doing Civil War Digital Digest and knowing what Andrew and I are talking about, anybody interested in the Prussian drill, worried about getting lost in the weeds, we got a whole field of weeds that we're going to hit on another couple of days there for you. So stay tuned, that's coming, but not for today. Felix, let's leave the Civil War and let's go afterwards. If you take us through post-war life with Wilich up to the end of his life.
Yeah, so after the war, Wilich was, we didn't talk about it before, but he was a very radical political abolitionist. And even before the war, he was advocating for civil rights for blacks that goes beyond legal equal rights, but also equal rights as humans in society. And of course, he was somehow disappointed with the result of the Civil War because blacks had just even started fighting for civil rights, and he was advocating for a lot of things, and was doing rallies and was very active in trying to rescue some of the political gains that were won during the Civil War. But at the same time, he was kind of disillusioned, I would say, and had some personal battles to fight out against some of his opponents. He was for 2 years auditor of Hamilton County and earned a lot of money during that time. But at the same time, he was involved in a scandal. Had to go to the courts to defend himself. And after that, 1 year later, he went to a holiday trip to Germany in 1870 to see the old fatherland again. He was allowed to go back there once he was sentenced to death, but in the meantime he was pardoned and was allowed to go back to Germany. And this was exactly a few weeks before the war between Prussia and France was starting. And so he was back in Germany in 1870, and he even tried to play a role in this war, but failed to do so. Instead, he went to university in Berlin, studied for 1 semester, then went back to the US and continued to be politically active. He was against President Grant. He was part of the liberal Republican movement in 1872. He tried to create a new party in 1873, a People's Party, because he thought Democrats and Republicans, both parties, were corrupt in a sense, and not what he wanted at that point in time. And in the later years, after 1873, it gets more quiet around him, and he was old, and he was we didn't talk about it, but he was injured during the Civil War. He lost his right arm. He couldn't use his right arm, and so he was kind of leading a quieter life in his later years, continuing to study, giving lectures, playing with the children in St. Mary's, this small town where he was living. And yeah, when he died in 1878, this was basically the biggest event in the small city of St. Mary's that they ever witnessed. 2,500 people were coming and giving the last honor to Wilich.
And a life well lived with a lot of things that we've covered a lot today. Try
to wrap it up fast.
There's a lot to do and there's a lot to wrap up. Gang out watching us as we come towards the end. I'm going to give everybody a chance to sort of put a button on it. If you've got questions, now's the time. Throw them into the chat. We can ask questions at this point. So, Andrew, you're sort of the home team. Let me start with you as far as any less thoughts there.
Well, I just think, this is another example of sort of personally my whole feeling on history is that these were all actual real people. They may be historical figures, but they were real people with families and interpersonal relationships and that sort of thing. And so to see the connections that these guys all have, not just the 48ers, sort of how they spread out and affected the outcome of the Civil War, but just here in Cincinnati and with the formation of the 9th Ohio Regiment, it just sort of really drives home that these people had everyday lives that they lived, before, and this big event, the Civil War, was not something that really defined most of them.
Just it was a one facet, not the beginning, middle, and end of their lives. Okay. Felix, let's go over to Germany. And any thoughts from you, sir?
Well, thank you so much for this discussion. Really enjoyed it. No final thoughts.
Okay, that's totally fine. You've got a lot of time to share, and we really appreciate you taking time away from other things going on there, as with all of you. David, the book just came out. Talk to us again about it, and we'll let you bring things to a close here. What are your thoughts on Philip? Anything we haven't covered that you'd like to get us to think about here?
Yeah, I think the big thing I'd like the audience to take away is that to think about the Civil War as more than just a sectional conflict within the U.S. To think of it as a long-term global revolution that was really unprecedented in world history in terms of its scope and influence. And I see Wilich and his counterparts, especially the 48ers, as radicals that helped transform a war to save the Union into a wholesale social revolution, as Felix mentioned. So I think it's really important to look at leaders like Wilich and expand our view of the Civil War beyond North versus South.
Okay.
So that's
Great.
my takeaway.
It's a great takeaway. I want to say thanks to all three of you for giving us some time on Sunday afternoon here in the States, late morning in California, and evening in Germany. Thank you, fellas, all for the work you've done to get ready for this. David, I can't wait to get a copy of the book myself. We'll be seeing that come through pretty quick. Gang out there in our world, this is going to be available for replay here on Facebook, and as we start the Two More Historic Events YouTube channel, you see David's website. Obviously, we know we can find books on Amazon, but if we can go directly to the author, we help them make a little bit more. So here's a way to help David for that work. And for now, for Two More Historic Events, I just want to say thanks for spending your time, whether you're catching us live or catching us on a replay. We'll see you again down the road. Take care now.